morning. I don't know what it is about the weekends and weather around here. I was close to telling Deb not to put in the inclement weather announcement in the folder this week. Now I'm glad I didn't. And we'll just wait and see what next week brings too. If you didn't get the gist of the songs this morning, they were about love. And that's because Wednesday is a number of important things on that day. First of all, it's Valentine's Day. And also, it's Ash Wednesday in the beginning of the Lenten season. And so it's only appropriate that we talk about the love of God in a number of ways, oftentimes, and we will focus particularly in the Lenten season on the activity of God, even as we continue our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. If you want to follow along this morning, we're going to be in the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 4, and we're going to run through verses 4 through 16. Many years ago, when I was a young teenager, there was a popular pop rock group called Three Dog Night. They had a particular song that fits in real well with the sermon topic this morning, and that is, one is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. And then in the chorus of the lyric of that song, the writer says, two can be as bad as one. But the loneliest number is the number one. And the whole gist of the song is that the writer's been jilted by the love of his life and he's all by himself. How appropriate in many ways are the words to songs. One sociologist made the observation that the music of your era reflects the values of your culture. And so Frank Sinatra sang, I did it my way. Neil Diamond had a song called Solitary Man. Simon and Garfunkel had a song entitled Diamond Island, in which they extol the virtues of living life solitarily and self-centeredly. And that's basically the thesis of the book of Ecclesiastes. The argument of the preacher king in retrospect of his life is simply this: when all we do is live life for ourselves, we find out that in the watchwords of the book of Ecclesiastes, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. In other words, life has no point if all we do is live it for ourselves. It becomes futile, it becomes a rat race, and it becomes like herding cats or striving after wind, as the writer of Ecclesiastes puts it. And he confines his observations to that phrase, under the sun. Under the sun. That's his limited horizontal view. Last week we looked at the ultimate reality of life and death. And his observation was that no matter how hard you work or how little you do, you both wind up in the same place. That's death. And he says there is no justice in life. It seems like the wicked oppress the poor and the poverty-stricken and the weak. And there is no justice neither now nor in life after death. He seems like he's asking the question, when will God ever right this wrong? Although he doesn't really specifically spell out how God's going to do that, or if God will do that at all. His bottom line is this: perhaps it would be better if I'd never been born, because everything I see under the sun simply is evil and a striving after wind. His bottom line assessment, simply as we ended last week, was simply this: under the sun, life seems pointless and meaningless. He continues that thought in this section here in the rest of chapter 4 of the book of Ecclesiastes. So we're going to be looking at verses 4 through 16. There are 3 stories told in each of these sections that we'll look at this morning. One of the things that helps us understand the Bible and can help us understand the Bible is that if we figure out how the writers of the Old Testament tried to communicate to us truths, timeless truths out of the writings of the Old Testament. One of the ways in which the writer of Ecclesiastes tries to show us the broad brushstroke of his view of life under the sun is by comparison. The Hebrew language tries to paint a picture for you. Sometimes it's a very broad mural of life. The book of Ecclesiastes is full of those broad brushstrokes. Sometimes the writer will, in the Hebrew language, paint a very detailed, specific picture of life, and in a very small setting. Here he gives us 3 small settings about ultimate realities of life. And they are done in comparison. One of the devices used by Old Testament writers was the idea of comparing one thing against another. For instance, if you go to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 15 and verse 22, the writer of 1 Samuel simply uses that device of comparison to show us a truth. And here's what it says. It is better to obey than to sacrifice. Now the whole point of that is that Samuel talking to Saul. And Saul has disobeyed the direct command of God given through Samuel. He says, no, do not take any spoils from your defeat of the Philistine king. Don't do that. And what does Saul do? He defeats the king, he spares the king's life, and he takes spoils in direct disobedience to God. Samuel comes and he hears the bleating of the sheep that have been taken in the spoils of war, a direct violation of God's command. And he walks up to Saul and he says, what do I hear? Well, I hear the bleating of sheep. What's the meaning of this, Saul? There were to be no spoils taken. So what's going on here? And Saul rationalizes his disobedience by saying, I want to show off my victory. And here's the king, and I've defeated an enemy, and look, all the spoils of the conquest. Why would I want to get rid of these valuable assets? You see, animals in the day were valuable commodity. They were cash. And it wasn't just the animals that had taken in the victory. He'd also sacked those Philistines and their personal goods too. And so Samuel says, to obey is better than sacrifice. In other words, a genuine heart of trust in God is better than going through the motions. Better than going through the motions and pretending you have an obedient heart when you don't. Again, the value and device of comparison. And so you're going to see this morning in our passages comparisons. Comparisons that seem almost opposites in some cases. But they prove a point. They teach a truth. One of those comparisons is in verse 9. Because all 3 stories are going to have comparisons. And the first few words of verse 9 of Ecclesiastes 4 are interesting because it says, 2 are better than 1. 2 are better than 1. And so the literary device of comparison will be used in all 3 of these situations. All 3 of these situations. Proverbs 15:17, or Proverbs 15:16, which is on the front of the folder simply says this: better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble. Again, an Old Testament writer using a literary device of comparison of opposites and extremes to teach us the truth. It's better you don't have everything you want and fear God than to have everything you want and not fear God and have trouble. The Old Testament is full of these comparisons. We're going to look at 3 of them right now. So, under these 3 comparisons, here we go. The first is how to be content, verses 4 through 6 of Ecclesiastes 4. And here's what he says. I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. If I ask you to give a title to that part of that verse, what might it be? Keeping Up with the Joneses would be a great title, right? Keeping Up with the Joneses. Verse 4 ends by saying, this too is vanity and striving after wind. Verse 5 is the comparison device used by the writer of Ecclesiastes. And he gives an opposite and extreme view of verse 4. He says, in verse 5, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. There is the comparison device. Verse 6 is a principle or a truth statement. One handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after wind. How to be content. These 3 verses could be emblazoned across the headlines of any digital newspaper or any paper newspaper or any news magazine in America today, because they embody the extremes of American culture. Verse 4 simply embodies the person who is a workaholic for the simple sake of acquiring. I see it all the time on bumper stickers. I owe, so off to work I go. He who dies with the most toys wins. That's, for many people in our world today, the mindset of life. That defines their life. It's always to have the best, the latest. I love it. The cell phone carriers have finally figured out that if a new model of a phone comes out, we don't want to wait to a year and a half to get the next new model. So they've changed their marketing philosophy to market to our desire to have the latest. And all you got to do is sign up under AT&T Next, and for the next 24 months you make the payments on the phone. You can get a phone whenever you want, or 30 months, whatever it is. But if you want a new phone in a shorter period of time, you can buy it, but you got to pay off the old one. And so it is, a chasing after wind. The shelf life of computers are less than a month now because of the new inventions. It's always bigger and better. We've got to change the carpet, we've got to change the floor, we've got to change the appliances, we've got to change the car, we've got to change our hair. We've got to change our figure, we've got to change our bank account. It's endless. The observation of the Preacher King in verse 4 is absolutely spot on, not only in 2018, but in his day. And when you chase it down in the Word of God, it's been with us from day one. I've seen that every labor and every skill which is done is a result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. How to be content. And in verses 4 and 5, he gives you 2 opposites, 2 extremes. Now he said in chapter 2 that work is a gift of God. That in order to explain the futility of working so you can have something, only to realize that the person who doesn't do anything winds up in the same place as the person who knocks their brains out. And that doesn't well define life and give life meaning. Then here he simply gives us 2 extremes of comparison. And his point is simply this: work without proper understanding can be distorted into one of 2 extremes. Either envy for what another person has, or laziness to the point that it not only consumes the resources of the person in verse 5, but it consumes what his also. So in How to Be Content, the first thing he gives us are 2 extremes. There is the one in verse 4 who is a workaholic and dies an early death while trying to have everything and satisfy himself. And the polar opposite extreme is in verse 5, and that is the person who will not even bother to put forth any effort so winds up cannibalizing himself. He consumes not only what he has, but he also consumes what he gives. So how in the world do we learn to be content? Verse 6 tells us one truth. One truth. Learn to be content. In verse 6 it simply says this: one handful of rest, and that's an interesting word. Maybe your translation says quietness or peace. One handful of rest is better than 2 fistfuls of labor and striving after wind. If you remember the alcoholic beverage commercial that says you only go around once in life, grab all the gusto you can get, it would seem to indicate that verse 4 and verse 6 contradict that marketing scheme. How in the world can I learn to be content? How can I live in a rat race, acquire all you can, get the latest world, and learn contentment? How to be content. How do I do that? Learn to be content. Well, verse 6, the preacher king offers a truth. Learn to be content. The word rest there, quietness or peace, has a synonym in the New Testament called contentment. Contentment. And so, Paul talks about that in his letter to Timothy in 1 Timothy 6. How in the world can I learn to be content? Paul simply picks up on a topic going on in Timothy's life where there are those out spreading the gospel but distorting it, perverting it, twisting it, saying that the gospel and Jesus Christ will give you whatever you want. And then in verse 6, Paul makes the contrast. He makes the comparison. Over against what others are saying, Timothy, here's what the truth is. Godliness is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. Now remember, this is the guy who writes in Philippians 4:19 that I've learned to be content in whatever state. He doesn't mean geographical location. He means whatever circumstance he's in. He says, I've learned to be content in whatever state I'm in, whether I'm in want or whether I have an abundance. The issue of contentment is not what you have, it's what has you. And in verse 4 and 5, he simply shows under the sun the realities that there are two kinds of people. Those who will work their brains out simply to acquire and have and find meaning in life, that doesn't satisfy. And the opposite extreme is the person who won't do anything and has nothing and ends up in the same place. And he says, how do we find contentment between these two comparisons? Between the person who kills himself at an early age because they burn the candle at both ends, and the person who dies because they have nothing and they don't bother to try and take care of themselves. How do we find contentment in our world? Learn to be content. Paul simply points his finger to God and says, first of all, it's not what you have, but what has you. So what will make you content? What gives meaning to your life? And then he goes on in verse 7 there in 1 Timothy, and he simply says this: we've brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of it. Bottom line is, whatever you've worked for so hard all of your life to have and acquire and hold and maintain, rest assured it isn't going with you. It isn't going with you. And then he simply carries on over into the next couple of verses. He says, if we have food and company with these, we shall be content. And then he goes on to talk about those who pierced themselves through with many arrows, self-inflicted wounds, because they believe that money and possession define their life and their significance. How do I learn to be content? Well, simply this. Be content with what you have. And then secondly, realize that contentment doesn't come from what you have, but who has you. A little girl was asked to quote Psalm 23, she misquoted it. Instead of saying, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she said this, "The Lord is my shepherd, that's all I want." She spoke how to be content. The Preacher King observes in verse 4, one kind of person who works themselves simply out of envy and keeping up with the Joneses, and that doesn't define life well. The second person he gives as comparison is the person who doesn't do anything and winds up self-cannibalizing themselves. Then he simply gives us the truth. Learn to be content in verse 6. One handful of rest is better than two fistfuls of labor and striving after it. Now we're going out of order in these comparisons this morning. We're going to drop down to verses 13 through 16. How to lead. How to be a good leader. And I've got to tell you, verses 13, 14, and 15 get to be rather confusing as we read them. So we'll read them and then we'll come back and try and untangle this Gordian knot. Verse 13, he gives us a comparison. He says, "A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction." Verse 14, "For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom." I want to stop right there. Who in the world is he talking about? Well, some people believe that he's talking about himself, except that Solomon was born in the king's palace. He wasn't born poor. And he never went to prison. Now, some people believe there are two kings there. The poor young one and the old foolish one. And then some people believe there's a third king there because of verse 15. "I've seen all the living under the sun thrown to the side of the second lad who replaces him." Some people believe that's a third king. Or it's the first king who was the poor young lad. And then some think that it's somebody else or a group of people or a conglomeration, an amalgamation of three different characters combined into one. What's his point? His point is simply this. First of all, no matter who the king is, whether it's David or Solomon, or some see it as Joseph because there's a reference to being in prison, or some other king, or other kings. The point is simply this. Kings come and kings go. Now read verse 16. "There is no end to all the people. To all who were before them, and even the ones who will come later, will not be happy with him, for this too is vanity and striving after women." Bottom line in the comparison is simply this. Whether you have a young, poor king who rises through the ranks to become king, or you have an old king established in his ways, or you have someone else who replaces either one of them, kings come and kings go, and guess what? Ultimately, their legacy gets spoiled. Nobody likes them. And the second thing is, nobody remembers them. And that's why, for those of you who haven't memorized the presidents of the United States in their order, when we say number 12, you'll see Washington, and I got lost. The tale here of the kings is simply this. If it's David being the young one in verse 13, and he rises up from shepherd boy up through to be king of Israel, guess what? David is replaced. If the old king in verse 13 might possibly be a reference to Solomon as he looks at his own life, guess what? Who replaces Solomon? Well, the kingdom splits in two. And you have two kings now, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And then you read the book of 1st and 2nd Kings and you discover that they have great turnover in kings. And some kings last a few weeks, some a few months, some several years. And the bottom line is, as you read 1st and 2nd Kings, and he died and slept with his fathers. Kings come and kings go. So how in the world do I learn to lead? How can I be a good leader? What's the observation here in the comparison device that he uses? What's the observation? What's the truth he wants to teach us? He wants to teach us how to be a good leader. And the first thing to remember is that fame is fleeting in verse 16. Kings come and kings go. Presidents come and presidents go. Mayors come, mayors go. Senators, congressmen, on and on the list goes. People come and go in places of leadership. And time passes and the leaders are oftentimes forgotten. Fame is fleeting. The second thing to learn about how to lead is simply this, that position is temporary. As enamored as we get with who's the leader, remember it's temporary. So don't get caught up in the I'm the boss, I'm the leader trap. You ever study Moses' statements to Joshua when Moses is about ready to be taken off of the scene? He doesn't tell Joshua, although Joshua watches and observes for 40 years in the wilderness, what Moses does. But Moses simply gives Joshua one bit of advice on how to lead. He says, first of all, pay attention to the command of the Lord. And second, stay on the path. Don't go to the left, don't go to the right. Don't deviate from what God says. What are we going to do without Moses? I don't know. Here's Joshua. What are we going to do without Joshua? I don't know. Here's the next leader. What are we going to do without Saul? Here's David. What are we going to do without David? Here's Solomon. What are we going to do without Solomon? Here's... The apostles said, what are we going to do without you, Jesus? Jesus says, I'm the only king who ever sticks around. He says, I am with you even to the end of the age. Kings come and kings go, but there's one king that's always there. Position is temporary. One king passes off the scene, another king rises. Remember, your ability to lead is not tied to your skill level, it's tied to your ability to at least listen to and accept advice. And that's the third thing the tale of the kings tells us. Be teachable. Be teachable. Fame is fleeting. Don't fall into the fame trap as a leader. The best kind of leader, Jesus said, is a servant leader, because that's what he was. And he didn't come to be served, but to serve. It's temporary for us. There's only one eternal king. That's Jesus. He's not sharing that with anybody else. Leaders come and leaders go. But how to be a good leader is found in verse 13. Be teachable. The old king, in verse 13, simply said of him, simply this: he's old, he's foolish, because he doesn't know how to receive advice. He doesn't know how to receive a warning. Be teachable. It's in the Gospels where Jesus says of Moses that he was a meek man. Now, most of us have a distorted view of the word meek. We think of meek as a wimpy, dish rag type of person. Interestingly enough, when you do a word study of the word meek there in the Gospels, as Jesus talks about Moses being a meek man. In fact, he was the most meek man on the face of the earth, Jesus said, and that's quite a statement. Meekness literally means to be trainable. In fact, the word comes from the breaking of a wild horse by placing a bridle in its mouth and controlling that animal with a little bit in the day of wood or leather strap. It literally means to have great strength harnessed. And Jesus says of Moses that he was a trainable, teachable person. And when you ask any Hebrew or Jew to name the three greatest patriarchs of their nation, you will get Abraham and Isaac and Moses. Some will give you David. If you ask for the greatest matriarch of Israel, you will get the name Golda Meir. The word meek simply means teachable. And there's a lesson here in this comparison of kings and how to lead. And it simply is this. Whether you are poor and young, whether you are old and passing off the scene and out of the way of leadership, there's one thing that makes a great leader no matter who you are or where you are or what you are doing, and that is be teachable. Be teachable. You didn't know how to take advice or receive a warning anymore. How to be content? Learn the truth that it's not what you have that will make you content, it's what has you. How to lead? Recognize that fame is fleeting, position is temporary. The real key to being a leader is to be teachable, trainable, and wise. And now, going back to the middle part of those verses there, we come to the third comparison he gives us to teach us the truth about life under the sun. Verses 7 through 12. And here he gives us our title. Verse 7, he says, I looked again at vanity under the sun. There was a certain man without a dependent, without a second, is how it's literally translated, meaning another. Having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches. And he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? This too is vanity, and it is a grievous task. Continue on the thought with me. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion, but woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. I'm going to stop right there. I haven't read the last part of verse 12. But we'll get to that. How to be a partner? Now, most people read this text, this section of the text, and when they get to verse 9, their brain kicks over to, he's talking about marriage. Well, resist that temptation, because he's not. You can read that in, but it's not his main point. Let's go back to the tale in verse 7 and 8. First question is simply this in the tale. Does this describe your life? Are you working and laboring and never stop to ask yourself, who gets this when I depart? What am I doing this for? Maybe you don't even ask it. Add the caveat at the end of the question, when I depart. Maybe you need to ask the question, who am I doing this for? Why am I burning the candle at both ends? Why am I in the rat race? Why am I on the hamster's wheel, spinning and spinning and spinning and going around and never going anywhere? The tale simply in verse 8 is this. The pointlessness of life is best expressed in the fact that somebody never stops to ask themselves, why am I doing what I'm doing? And tale is simply this: there's a guy who works all of his life. He doesn't have a second. He doesn't have a spouse. He doesn't have a brother. He doesn't have a son. He has no other person that he's working for other than himself. And he's simply expending all of his energy on working to get. He says he's striving in verse 8. He's striving, and there's no end to his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches. There is a driving force of this guy. He's a hoarder. He's a hoarder of wealth. He works simply to have. His eyes were not satisfied with riches. And he never stops to ask himself, who am I working for? Who am I working for? And at the end of the observation there in verse 8, he simply says, the preacher king simply says, for somebody who never stops to ask the question, who am I working for? Life becomes pointless. Because the acquisition and the having winds up not satisfying their life. The bottom line is, in verse 8, he's living for himself and he's frustrated to no end. All of his labor and all that he has does not satisfy him. In fact, he has all that he wants, but he has no pleasure in it. For many years, I slept in an upstairs bedroom in a 2-story farmhouse with an old hand-wind Victrola record player. The records were about that big. The front of the Victrola cabinet had that crushed velvet on it. And from time to time, I'd open it up and look in there, and the handle was still on the outside of it, and I'd turn it ever so gently in disobedience to my grandmother to see if the table would turn, and it would not. And I heard the story many times from my grandmother how the Victrola came to be in her life, and my grandfather, who at that time had passed away, how it had come to be in their life. It was a great acquisition. They worked long and hard to acquire enough money to buy the Victrola and the few records that they had stored at the bottom of that cabinet. For my grandmother, that defined her life. In her last few years, she was most concerned about who should get the Victrola. For all of my life, it never worked. It never played record one. To this day, I don't know who has the Victrola. Some relative, I suppose. I don't know. But here it is. They've lived all their life. My grandmother survived her husband for almost 50 years. Who are you working for? Because out of all that they labored to acquire, the bottom line is somebody else is going to do it. Then he gets to verse 9. In verse 9, the preacher king tells us a better way to live our lives than the guy in verse 8. Take some time to ask yourself a couple of questions. Number one, who am I working for? Who am I working for? Number two, take time to ask yourself, who's my partner? Ask yourself, who's got my back? Ask yourself, am I a solitary man? Am I an island? I don't need anybody? Because beginning in verse 9, the comparison is simply this: two are better than one. And he gives a number of reasons. After the tale of the solitary man in verses 7 and 8, and the observation that at the end of this man's life, it's vanity. He's lived his life and tried to define his life by his work and his acquisitions, but the ultimate reality simply is this. This guy's got all that he wants and all that he needs, and the point is simply this. It does not satisfy his life. He's not satisfied. He says, this too is vanity, and it is a grievous, I love that word grievous, it's futility. It's a grievous task. So then he says there's a better way. Two are better than one. And his point is simply this in verse 9. It's better to share your life than to be a solitary, self-centered human being. A better way. It's better to share our life than to make it on our own. And here he's not simply talking about marriage. He can include that, but it's a much broader range of thinking. Two are better than one. And the first lesson he gives is in verse 9. Why? Because you're more productive. Two are better than one. Because, in verse 9, they have a good return for the labor. You're more productive. We had to go out to the garden and help out the garden. Never could understand why we all, as children, had to go out to hoe the garden. There were times I tried not to hoe so good and get in the produce that was supposed to be saved. Got in trouble for that. And then my sisters and my brother grew up and moved away from home. And I still had to go out to the garden and hoe. And I learned the valuable lesson. Two are better than one. Three is better than two. And four is the best of all. Because you get done faster. There's more work accomplished. Simple observation. In verse 8, this guy does it all on his own, but the point is, had he bothered to ask, who am I working for, and bring in someone else to share in his life, what would he have discovered? He'd have been more productive. So would the other person. So the first lesson is you will wind up being more productive. Second, verse 10. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. What do you think of when you read that? I think of the television commercial advertising the metal work. And the old person has fallen, be it male or female, the old person has fallen. And the commercial starts out, help, I've fallen and I can't get up. I read that line here and I think of that immediately. The second lesson is there's help in times of trouble. And it doesn't have to be just physical trouble where you've fallen and you need some aid getting up. It can refer to any kind of trouble in your life. And having somebody there to help you through something is invaluable. Two are better than one. Third, he continues on. Verse 10. Woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Verse 11. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. And obviously everybody goes, oh, now he's talking about marriage. Well, not necessarily. Because in those days, if you traveled on business, you never went alone for two reasons. Number one, you needed somebody in the desert nights to travel with. Why? Because you might freeze to death out there. And the idea is that you back up together and keep each other warm through the night. The second reason is for safety's sake, as he points out. Verse 11, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? The answer is it's impossible. So, partnerships are valuable. And the first part of verse 11 is simply the idea of your own personal health. Traveling through the desert as a caravan leader or a businessman, you want somebody to go with you. Why? So that A, you will stay warm. You'll preserve your own health. B, in verse 12, if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. For safety's sake. For safety's sake. Because There weren't police cars and policemen roaming all over the place. Authorities and law enforcers were in cities, not out in the desert. And so, who was out in the desert? The thieves, the robbers. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan? What happened to the guy who's on the road by himself? He falls among robbers. He gets ambushed and robbed and beaten to the point of death. And here's the point he simply makes in verse 12. If one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. For safety's sake. I keep hearing it on the news all the time, especially ladies, in areas where you are unfamiliar with your surroundings. If it's dark or if it's crowded, don't go alone. Don't go alone. There's safety in numbers. There's personal protection in numbers. It helps you keep you warm. Here the picture is of a traveling man who's out on a business trip, and he takes with him a companion, not only for sharing the work, but also so they can preserve each other's life in the desert. And for safety's sake. A better way. A better way. Ask yourself this question: who has my back? Because we all need someone to have our back. We all need someone who will stand there and support us when life gets rough. Whether it's financial or health-wise, whether it's a spiritual issue, whether it's a time of sorrow and grieving, two are better than one. A better way. And then, the last part of verse 12 that I didn't read. Because you all know the saying, two's company, three's. I'll read the last part of verse 12. Ecclesiastes 4:12, he simply says, a cord of three is not quickly torn apart. If two's company, three's better. Three's better. Now, I've given you a passage there, Luke 7:34. Jesus is in a social gathering, and there are a number of people there. One group of people don't like the other group of people, wouldn't have anything to do with him if their life had been lived. And they said of Jesus, he is the friend of sinners and the unrighteous. What's better than two? It's the third person, and especially if the person is Jesus. The writer of Proverbs says this: a brother is born for adversity, and there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. If he's talking about marriage in verse 12 there in that last line, then he's talking about something that's a little odd and twisted. But if he's talking about human relationships, and if he's talking about the fact that the third strand can refer to, although he doesn't specifically say it, can refer to Jesus Christ, then it's true that in any partnership, the most important ingredient is not who the other partner is, it's having the most important partner, Jesus Christ. Because Jesus Christ, as Luke 7:34 says, is a friend to sinners and the unrighteous. Better than two is three. And the best partner of all, Luke 7:34 says, is Jesus himself. How to be a partner? How to be a partner? Do you have someone in your life that's got your back? Do you have someone that you're traveling along with and working with? And it doesn't just have to be a job, a working job. There are way too many lone rangers in the body of Christ who try to do it all and be it all. And the point of this passage simply is this: that ministry, unshared, becomes a burden. It becomes like the guy in verse 8. And at the end of his life, he never stops to ask, who am I working for? It's always a good question for us to ask ourselves as followers of Jesus Christ. Not only who's training me, but who am I training? Not only who's building into my life, but whose life am I building into? Who needs help? Who needs another set of hands, another set of ears, a shoulder? Some wisdom, some guidance, some help. Two's company, three is better. And then there's the song by Bill Withers, Lean On Me. Lean on me. Because Bill Withers didn't write it and sing it first. Jesus said it in the Gospel of Matthew. He says, "Come unto me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." He says, "I will be your partner. Let me handle the tough tasks and learn from me." Learn from me. And the Preacher King simply gives us 3 lessons out of his life in retrospect to tell us that if we look at life and try to define it on our own and by ourselves, we have missed the point of life and we will never find satisfaction and meaning in a self-centered, selfish lifestyle. 2 are better than one, especially when that partner is Jesus Christ. Let's pray. Father, this morning we thank you for these timely words. Not only to our hearts and our souls and our minds, not only to those who this morning share in the audience, but in a world that is day by day constricting and becoming solitary and singular. Lord, in your word you describe the days of the end as the hearts of men will grow cold and unloving. We will shrink into defining life simply as our own little domain for ourselves. We will become more and more selfish, more and more self-centered. And the Preacher King warns us that this is pointless and meaningless and will never satisfy our souls. It is no life. So Lord, help us to turn our hearts and our eyes away from our schedules, away from what we have, to what has us. Because we brought nothing into this world. We will take nothing out. Help us to understand how to be content, how to be a leader, how to be a partner. It's all related to the one who is ultimately the picture of contentment, Jesus Christ, to the one who is ultimately the consummate leader, Jesus Christ, to the one who is ultimately the best person to share our life with, Jesus Christ. For hearts that are struggling with the answer to that issue, I pray, Lord, in ways that I don't understand, you would draw them to. And for those of us who've committed our lives and hearts, our strength, our mind, and our soul to you, deliver us from falling into the little traps that Satan wants to catch us in. Because the Lord is my shepherd. That's all